Today is a big one. I'm honored to welcome one of the most influential voices in reading research, Dr. Timothy Shanahan.
Thank you, Stacy. It's good being here. Thanks for inviting me.
Your new book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, How Students' Reading Achievement Has Been Held Back and What We Can Do About It, published by Harvard Press, is already sparking fierce, necessary conversations about how we teach reading and what must change. You, Dr. Shanahan, bring decades of research, leadership, and federal reading initiatives and tireless work bridging classrooms and science that has shaped how educators, like me, around the world think about comprehension, text complexity, and the most important thing, equity in literacy instruction. Literate nation is a liberated nation. So, again, Dr. Shanahan, welcome to On the Road to Literacy Success.
Great being here.
Let's start with your journey. You've spent decades studying how reading is taught and learned. What inspired you to write this book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives? And what do you hope this book helps educators see or do differently?
Well, back about 15 years ago, I was working on something with a lot of other people, the Common Core State Standards. And I worked on parts of it, and other people worked on other parts of it, and so on. When they came out, I was both pleased and shocked. The parts that I felt like I'd really contributed to, I thought, wow, this is great. They really listened, and they paid attention to the research that we were steering to that group. But the part that shocked me is that those standards did something that no education standards had ever done in the United States before. Every other set of state standards up to that point always went out of their way not to set text levels that kids needed to be able to read to accomplish the standards at a given grade level. And the reason that it hadn't ever been done was because of a very strong belief in the field that had been there for decades, that you couldn't teach kids with grade level text. You had to teach them with reading level text. So the only time you'd teach a youngster out of a fourth grade book would be if you believe the youngster read at a fourth grade level. And you would do that whether the youngster was in fourth grade or whether they were in fifth grade. It didn't make any difference. The fear had been, oh my goodness, if you tell teachers that their kids are supposed to be able to read a book at a grade level book by grade level, teachers would actually do that, and it would be terrible. Kids wouldn't learn and so on. So I thought, well, that's crazy stuff. So I went and started reading the research on that. And again, I didn't really contribute to that part of the standards, though in retrospect, I wish I had. I really dug in on the research on it and very quickly figured out that, in fact, our beliefs, our ideology, what had driven me as a classroom teacher to test all those kids and get them to their levels and so on, was actually not necessarily very supportive of kids learning. We weren't doing the best thing for them. And so I started writing some pieces, mainly on my website, but some other places, saying that the standards were right and we ought to follow them, and we should be teaching kids at these grade levels and not at their reading levels. And of course, I got a lot of pushback. But I also got a lot of folks going, good, I've always believed that, or I think that he's right about that, or if that's what we should be doing, then that's great. A lot of notions of embrace the struggle and all of that, which was great. But in some ways, I think people accepted it too quickly. I think they embraced the idea without the idea really being very fully formed. Okay, if you're going to take a youngster who, say, reads at a second grade level and they're 9 years old, if you put them in the fourth grade book, how are you going to make sure they learn from that? Well, there really wasn't anything there. It was pretty empty. And so it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And there were studies coming along as that was going on. And I finally decided a couple of years ago that there was a lot of stuff out there, sort of, yay, teach with harder text, but not very much out there about, and here's how you do that. And so I thought, we need a book that really goes through the research, the years of thought that went into the different ideas, and really show why you needed to teach with harder books, and then what would instruction look like? How would it be different than what we do in our classrooms today? And I thought that really needed a book level treatment, not a series of articles or blogs or talks around the country or podcasts like this. So that was what led me to do that.
And in your book, to your point, providing that practical, this is what we can do. I do love sticking it quite up. How you section that out in the end of the book, just very practical. What can you do? Well, don't overdo it. Not every text must be challenged. So I love how you got to the granularity, and to your point, it took an entire book to be able to get the comprehensive nature out on the table for people. So
Yeah,
this must have taken quite a bit of time to write. That's what I was thinking as I was reading
yeah,
through it.
yeah, it did, and it was I've written a huge amount over a very long career, but, when I've written books, they've been co-authored books or edited books. This is the first time I have ever written a book where I was responsible for all of it. That's one thing, and you've, I'm sure, read enough books in this field to know that most books in reading education are really collections of chapters, whether they're written by an individual person or by a group of people. Oh, there's a chapter on phonics. Oh, there's a chapter on comprehension. Oh, here's a chapter on classroom management. It doesn't make them bad, but it's like writing a series of articles. This is book I had to essentially do a couple hundred pages on one idea. That's a little different for me, having to sustain thought that continuously. You described that end of the book. The first half of the book is largely about how did we get here? What does the research say? What mistakes are we making and how we're using research and so on and so forth, which I think is practical in a way, but it doesn't tell you what to do in a classroom. It should raise lots of concerns about how we've been teaching. And then the second half of the book, there's a chapter on what do you do in terms of building up decoding ability and ability to make sense of the words and the fluency of a text. A chapter on comprehension that really is very heavy on language. How do you teach kids the language that they need so that they can make sense of text? A chapter on motivation, because so many people are afraid that if you put kids in grade level text, they're going to fall apart or they're going to act out in the classroom. And so we go through all the research on that. And then finally, still trying to stay to the research, but what about those questions where we really don't have research? What's my thinking on that? What could I suggest to folks? And, there I dream a little bit, but that's laid out pretty clearly so that no one's going to be misled and go, he's making claims that, we don't have proof yet. Well, that it says that. So I hope that folks benefit both from the really taking a close look at our practices and why they're not working the way we'd like them to, and then how could you do this effectively, not just, oh yeah, let's do it. And so I think it does both of those things. At least I tried.
Yes, very practical. And to your point, chapter 9, it does seem like that's the cherry on the top. Just head right into the practical application. And to your point, educators are working very, very hard. We have a bazillion programs. So we have the core plus a million supplements. We're reconstructing assessment systems. We're going through a few years of science of reading training. I mean, just the plates of educators these days seem to be heavier and heavier. Why are we not getting the results that people deserve, right? So thank you so much for writing this book. Which leads us to, your book makes a bold claim that decades of leveled reading practices intended to help students have instead limited their growth. And just to go back to teachers, as a classroom teacher myself for a very long time, and then principal, et cetera, results mattered to us. And when we saw results not moving in the direction in which we wanted them to, that felt very personal to me and to the teams in which I served with. So when teachers don't feel successful, that's a problem. We need teachers. We need people to be able to, the big people to be able to grow the little people. So going back to your book, that decades of leveled reading practices intended to help students have instead limited students in their growth. What is the central argument of leveled reading, leveled lives, and why does it matter so much right now? And that also goes back to the first question that we contemplated together.
Yeah. The basic idea made sense to a whole generations of teachers, including me as a teacher. I want to make this very clear. As a classroom teacher, I tested all my boys and girls on informal reading inventories at the beginning of every year and spent hours and hours and hours doing that individual testing of each kid to find their level. And I had books from multiple programs so that I could have all the kids at the right levels. And I had all the reading time divided among these little groups that I would get to work with briefly. And I was sure that's why people thought I was a good teacher and why that kind of stuff. And so when I figured out, when I was early in my scholarly career, early in my university career, I was given the opportunity to write a chapter about something. But the idea of this book that they were publishing was that they would get a number of reading researchers and they would ask them to identify a study that had made some big difference in reading education in the past. And they wanted to republish the study. And they wanted the person who'd selected it to write a commentary on it. And then somebody was going to write a response to that commentary. So every section would have, you might have 2 or 3 or 4 of these pieces, but they'd each have 3 distinct pieces. I was a new professor. This was the first time anybody had ever asked me to write a chapter. So I was really excited and wanted to do it. I'm going to be great. They asked, they had all kinds of big name people already invited for this book and had picked a lot of really famous studies. And they asked me what I would pick, having looked at their list. And I said, wow, I can't think of anything that made a bigger difference in my classroom than being able to get everybody at their level so that they would learn. And I optimize learning. This is going to be so great. And so I've never read the study that this was all based on. I would like to do that. And they said, well, okay, you could do that. That'd be fine. Go ahead. But unfortunately, it was a doctoral dissertation. It had never been published. I wasn't the only one who hadn't read it. So I tracked it down and the university where it was done, they generously lent it to me. And my assumption was, without having ever seen it or never heard it even described in detail, my assumption was that what they had done was tested some kids, found their instructional level, taught those kids at the instructional level, and the other kids just worked on reading the way they normally did in a classroom where they might work on the grade level text and so on. And that what they'd found was that the kids being taught at their instructional level did better, which is why we were doing this. So I thought, well, this is going to, I start reading this book, this dissertation, and I would read 5-10 pages and then go back and look at the cover, look at, the spine, look at the title page. I didn't think it was the right book. I thought they'd sent me a mistake because they didn't do anything like that. In fact, they never tried the idea out. What they did is they took a group of 41 fourth graders and they gave them informal reading inventories. And what they were looking for, and that was the end of the study. They had these 41 kids tested in reading, and then they looked at those test scores and said, how many oral reading mistakes could the kids make and still get 75 to 89% reading comprehension on the passage? That was the study. They never, and then, oh yeah, this is how you do it. This is how you'll optimize learning. Publish that, but I've got to admit, I put that in the bottom drawer of my desk, never talked about it because I was scared to death somebody would ask me, what would you do? Now what should we be doing given that this is just made up and they didn't really test it? What should we be doing? And I had no answer. I had no idea what else we would do because I'd always taught using that. So it was a little scary. It was fun. And so literally for 20 years, I tried not to talk about it. Did anything I could to not tell people because I had no alternative and I didn't know that anybody else had any alternative. So it was, and if anyone ever acted like you should be having kids read harder text, it was always shot down because we all know that's silly. This idea that comes into education generally in the 1910s, but really gets operationalized where you're going to try to get kids to a very high level for any book they're going to take on, comes in the 1940s and 50s. And it comes in and out of education. It mainly just growing slowly over time to the point now where surveys show it's like 65-70% of elementary teachers say they do this, and the numbers are almost as high for middle school teachers, and even like a third of high school English teachers or language arts teachers are actually claiming to do this as well. So this is something it's pervasive. It's so many of us do it. I guess we all do it, is what it feels like. It's an idea that in a way it works. I mean, I've got to say, as a little kid in the 1950s, that's how I was taught to read. The teacher had three groups. There was the good readers and the average readers and the dummies, and they did all the stuff that they did. That's just how we did it, and for decades. Well, when you start to say, but that okay, you can teach kids to read that way, but is it especially effective? Does it get you what Betts was going to, the man who came up with the idea of testing the kids and figuring out their levels and so on? His notion was that if you place the kids in books like that, you would optimize learning. You'd get the best you could get. And I got to admit, if you've ever been in a classroom where there are kids who are far below the book's level, it's pretty scary what you see going on, because the teachers don't really know what to do with that. And there isn't a scheme or a plan in place. And so, having a situation where at least kids are able to read the books and they may learn a little bit from what they're being taught, nothing wrong with that. But we're in a situation now where reading levels have really kind of languished for the last 50 years or so. And it really is time that American kids start moving forward and doing better, say, than my generation was doing in school. That's going to take teaching. And so you look at the research and you say, okay, so teaching at the instructional level works. Teaching with leveled books works. Can we do better? And what a growing body of research is saying, indeed you can, if you're willing to teach kids with books they can't already read well. There are some very interesting studies. There was a study done, I think I'm the only one who's ever cited it. It was a doctoral dissertation done, I think in the 1970s. So it's not a new study, but new in a way since nobody pays any attention to it. What the researcher did, a fellow by the name of Colin Dunkeld, he went and tested a bunch of second graders, find out what their reading levels were. Same kind of thing that I did in my classroom. But he wasn't the classroom teacher. He didn't, share the results with the teachers. He was just identifying which books the kids should be in according to the theory. And of course, he then monitored, well, what does the teacher actually have the kids in? So, Stacy tested out that she should be in a second grade book, but the teacher has her in a first grade book. Or it tested out that Stacy should be in a first grade book and the teacher has her at a second grade book. And what's going to happen? And so he has all these data and he follows the kids for the year and then tests them at the end of the year to see how much they've learned. How big are the reading gains that the kids make? Remember, he doesn't intervene. It's correlational. It's a natural experiment. What he finds is that the kids who make the biggest gains in second grade are not the children who start out with texts that they can read with 95% word accuracy or 90% word accuracy. They're not the kids who could read the text with 75% comprehension. These are kids who are, when they start out, the text is maybe more around 80%. In other words, these kids are making 20 oral reading errors in 100 words, and their comprehension levels are well under 50%. You go, well, they're in hard books. These kids, the teacher didn't put them in the right books, but those are the kids who learn the most. Those are the kids who make the biggest learning gains. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, if this is the kids' level and I put the kids in a book that's that hard for them, they know almost all the words. They can answer almost all the questions. If the youngster does really well and learns everything we're teaching, that's all the gain they're allowed to make. If the distance is greater between the youngster and the book, there's some room to learn there. And that can come from the teacher's teaching, that can come from the kid's own efforts, but there's not a natural, well, they can't learn any more than that because it should be far enough above where they are now. And so it really has become evident, again, as the research has grown, that there are more studies like that are finding teaching kids at their level either gives kids no clear learning benefit or it actually holds them back. They would do better, the group that was in the harder text actually learned more. And so I think we have a responsibility now to start shifting away from this idea of everyone being taught at their level, which is a method that if there's very little to learn, you don't need to teach very much. You just take the kids through the text. You give them practice, a little bit of practice. Maybe the teacher gives some feedback. Oh, I'll help you with a few of the words. Wow. I'm talking, if the text is harder, the kids are going to need more scaffolding. You're going to need more thoughtful teaching. The teacher's going to have to be more involved in this. It's not just well, I got them to the right level. Now they're going to read it and I'll ask them a few questions and we can then read something else next week. It requires more than that.
Which is such a good contemplation, thinking about teachers, leaders, and policymakers. And what you have just said, it just seems with the science of reading movement, there has been this growing idea that we can and should have everybody in a small group and level things out. And so talk to us. So the title itself and what you've been speaking about in terms of leveled reading, leveled lives, accessing complex text, what message are we hoping that teachers, leaders, and policymakers take away from what you're saying?
Well, I think, again, that first half of the book gets into, the research on this and why doesn't it work? I mean, again, to me as a teacher, it seemed like a good idea when I adopted it. These days, I wouldn't be doing that, but now I know more. I would argue that there are multiple reasons why it doesn't actually give us what we want. And one of the reasons is, you can test kids, but tests are imperfect. They all have a standard error of measurement. They all, there's a certain amount of, well, we said his score was 93, but it was really between 85 and 98, is what we can say with a little bit of certainty. And if you want more certainty, well, it was really 81. When you have those kinds of standard errors of measurement, we're spending an awful lot of time trying to make very precise decisions about kids based on tests that don't have that level of precision. And therefore, the tests are giving you an approximation. It'll say, oh, yeah, Tim reads at a third grade level, or, well, maybe a second grade level, or possibly a fourth grade level. And, so I'm going to put him in a second grade book or a third grade book based on that. I might be better off just staying with the grade level material and do less testing given that. Another problem, of course, is the measurement of the book difficulty. How we're going to set readabilities on these books. We're going to set levels on these books. And there are different leveling systems. The most scientific ones, the ones with the best measurement characteristics, tend to be things like Lexiles, where they actually have data on tens of thousands of kids that they're using. But even there, those are predictions, and they have a lot of variation in a text. So, for example, Lexiles, I think, is certainly among the best, if it's not the best, of these measurements. Well, how do they do it? They divide a text into 125-word chunks. They make a prediction about the level of each chunk, and then they take the average of that collection. In most books, the passages range from about a second grade level to about a high school or college level. And so even if you place it the way they say, it probably half the time the kids are going to be reading text or easier than that or harder than that. So again, we're going to do this very precisely. This book is probably at a third grade level, but it might be a second or a fourth grade book. So now we've got two approximates. Maybe we're too high on the kid and too low on, so we're not really doing what we claim we're doing. We're not really matching kids with books very well. And then the third thing is that you mentioned in the question is to make this work, of course. I've got kids at 3, 4, 5 different levels, 6 different levels in my classroom. I'm now going to have everybody working with different text, different skills. And how am I going to do that? That means I'm going to have to take however much time you've given me, a 90-minute block, 120-minute block, I'm going to have to divide that among that many groups. And so what used to be kids are getting 30 or 40 minutes of comprehension instruction, now everybody can have 10. And so the question is, what does the research say about that? Does that really give you that benefit? And in fact, study after study says Small group instruction does give you a small benefit, but you give it back when you reduce the amount of instruction that the kids are getting. And so we're working really hard. We're testing. We've got all the books on shelves and colored dots on them and in curtains, and everything is. And we're spending all the time testing the kids, and now we've got all the little groups that we're running among and trying to keep track of. And none of that is giving the big benefit that we would think, because you're not really getting kids to their level. You're reducing the amount of teaching time that they get, and that's not necessarily a good idea. There are uses of small group instruction, but our use of it has been not to differentiate instruction, but to differentiate curriculum. We're teaching the kids different things. And so if you say, this youngster's in 4th grade, but I'm going to teach him with the 2nd grade book, that means the 2nd grade content, that means the 2nd grade language. What you're going to guarantee is that when this youngster, say, goes, when do they get the 4th grade book? When do they get to deal with that language? And so we're making sure that kids don't ever get to the levels of reading that will actually allow them to fully participate in society. And the reason isn't because they're stupid or low in language or have lousy parents or all the stuff that you can blame on the kids or the families or whatever. But you just weren't willing to teach this kid the same thing you were trying to teach this other kid. And I think that's been a huge mistake. What we should be doing is trying to teach everybody the same thing, but adjusting the instruction so that more kids are able to succeed with that. And that means not necessarily lots of small group instruction, not a lot of, multiple curricula, lots of different skills and so on. That kind of thing can make a little bit of sense in at least early math, in arithmetic. You're not likely to be able to learn to multiply before you can add. I mean, that's pretty commonsensical. Language isn't like that. You can, well, that's a 4th grade word. I wouldn't want a 2nd grader learning that. Well, why not? That's not really a problem. It doesn't get in the way, and it's, oh no, they can't learn that word unless they know this other word. That just isn't true. And so I think we've been doing some things that, yeah, you're absolutely right. In a lot of cases, we're mandating these things that teachers do these, and we're doing it in the face of a huge body of research saying that it doesn't really benefit most of the kids. And then one last thing on it, and again, I'll tell a nasty story about myself. Back in the 1980s, so quite a while ago, sociologists started doing studies in classrooms looking at grouped instruction, the notion of we're going to have these homogeneous groups in reading and math and so on. And they started looking at that instruction to see who learned, who didn't, what the problems were that were associated with it. And what they were reporting was in reading was that when they were putting these kids into groups, it wasn't giving any big benefit to learning. And kids, especially at the time in those studies, African-American kids, it wasn't just that they weren't making the same gains as everybody else. If anything, the distance between the kids was increasing. They were being left behind because they were always in these low groups. And we have more recent research saying the same thing is happening to kids from single-parent families. I think you'd find the same thing with kids growing up in poverty. And so at the time, I read these studies and I go, oh, this is ridiculous. They don't understand that we have to, if that's these kids' levels, we need to teach them in those low groups so that they can get a chance to catch up. And then I find out that, in fact, teaching them in those low groups doesn't catch them up. In fact, we're holding them back. We're preventing them from keeping up with everybody else. Now I'm horrified. So at the time I thought, oh, this is, they don't know about the instructional level. They don't really understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. Now I don't understand why we're doing it because I've looked at the data and they're really problematic.
One thing that I really appreciate about you is that one of the many things is that you seem to be a teacher's teacher. I do not know one educator that has not said, oh my God, can you believe that I did that? I have thoughts of, I thought strumming the guitar and singing This Land Is Your Land was going to teach people something. I didn't know anything about sounds and symbols and matching them up. So the point to this being that for the listeners in the United States of America and across the international community. I would like to offer that if Dr. Timothy Shanahan, the person who led the National Reading Panel movement, can say, I used to think and now I know, and can you believe this was my practice and now I have evolved? I just really love that, because that just gives everybody permission to say, you know what? None of us have been perfect in our journey. And what it takes is changing. What it takes is saying, okay, I did it. Guess what? I've moved on. And I'm moving on because people furthest from educational justice deserve just as equal, if not more, of a chance to succeed as everybody else. And so thank you so much. This is a literacy is liberty. A literate society has more of an opportunity to be a liberated society. And isn't that what we want? We want communities that are able to thrive instead of, I'm just going to hold on to this. I'm going to go back to that small group. I'm going to keep teaching with level text because this is what's, quote, best for kids. So anyway, thank you for letting me insert that little caveat of just a continued inspiration that we all can do better. We all must do better. And who cares? I didn't even know how to teach kids how to read, and I paid $20,000 for my master's degree. So, there's hope for all of us. Very, very cool. And especially that policy at the state level, the mandates from the State Department saying you must do these things and we must have an exorbitant amount of small group. If we're at the State Department level, we can say things that are not right.
Absolutely. We really do need agencies that have access to the research and can do some things. I'm not political, and I don't want to get political here, but at the federal level, the Institute of Education Science is part of the Department of Education, that had been there for like 25 years, 24 years, something like that. As imperfect as it was, it certainly gave the states a place to turn to find out whether something had research behind it and whether something really had evidence supporting it. These days, I'm sure the state people are doing the best they can, but they're lacking some resources that in the recent past were there for them. And I hope some of this gets straightened out in the near future and we start again providing that. I do think states usually start out very like on phonics. Research is very clear. Teaching phonics gives kids some benefit. Very reasonable to have that as part of a state standards at certain grade levels. Very reasonable to insist that teachers be trained to do that kind of teaching if they're going to be teaching in any of those grade levels. That's all very reasonable. I do think at times once they do that, then they start going, what else do we like? Or I saw a good class that I liked what they were doing with phonics. Why don't we have everybody do it that way? And they're well-intentioned, but they start to drift from the research. They start putting things in place that actually don't have evidence or have very weak evidence, or in some cases, the evidence actually contradicts what they're saying. And so, they're not doing that on purpose, but it is one of those things that just because the state said it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually following the research. I've seen examples of both.
Absolutely. So let's talk about wrestling. Many educators wrestle with the tension between wanting students to feel successful and knowing that growth comes through challenge.
Yeah.
How can teachers give all students meaningful access to complex text while keeping instruction supportive and achievable? Sometimes we don't like to watch students, quote, struggle.
Yeah, well, I certainly feel the same way, but Emmett Bett's notion was that kids couldn't make reading progress if they couldn't comprehend the books they were being taught from. And that was the notion of you have to make sure that the kid can, if reading it on his own, he'd be able to answer 75 to 89%, pretty much 90% of the questions. You don't want him in that book was the notion. And so that's how they would guarantee that the youngster could comprehend. Now, this is an assumption, the notion that the kids have to be able to understand that text that you're teaching from. And so the way they'd guarantee it wouldn't be by teaching, it would be, let's just pick an easy enough book so that everybody can comprehend what we're working with and it'll all be fine. Let's say that we buy into it for the reasons you gave. Kids are going to wander away if they don't understand the book. We want to make sure they get it. But does that mean it has to start out being that easy? What if on Monday the youngster can't read this text well, but by Friday they're going to? Think about that for a moment. That's really what we're talking about here. This isn't for kids to go off on their own. This is for guided reading, directed reading, some kind of a communal reading. The group, the class is going to read this text together, and the teacher is going to help without telling you what it says, without reading it to you, is going to guide you so that by the end of the week, man, you can answer 90% of the questions and you can read a lot of the words and, terrific. And now next week we'll take on a different text and we'll go even farther. And so the notion of how do you guarantee we all want the kids to be successful. We don't want them to be falling apart and crying and frustrated. But that's not necessarily a book placement issue. It's a how much teaching support are you able and willing to give? That's where I think we've been differentiating on curriculum. I just won't teach you the same thing that I teach the other kids, and then I won't have to see you struggle. You'll never get where they get, but that's too bad for you. Or, gee, we're all going to learn the same thing. I'm going to have to give some of you more help than others. Maybe some of you are going to read this text more times this week than the other kids are. Maybe I'm going to do fluency work with this text with you, but I might not do it with the rest of the kids. I'm not going to be juggling 9 texts this week. We're going to work on one and we're going to work our tails off on it. And you're going to each day see that you're doing better with it. And, that's the payoff. And I think that's the payoff. I wrote in the book that was a payoff for the kids, but what you were saying earlier about the teacher needs to be able to see the kids are making progress. Quite often by the end of the week, because we place kids in books that are so easy for them, they can't tell that they've made any gains. And I think that's one of the reasons why such a large percentage of kids don't like their reading instruction. Surveys show that they really are not happy with what we're doing. And you look at that and you say, okay, if you can't see that you're learning, even if you're learning little bits every week and we're getting it, closing that little gap, if the kid can't see that, it's awfully hard to be motivated and excited. It's true for the teacher too. And we forget that. I forget that. The teacher is looking and going, well, we got through another story and the kids read it just as well as they did. And of course, what do we do? As soon as we've tested the kid and decided he's at a higher level, we move him to something where it's still going to look like this. We try to make sure that we hide any kind of progress so that the kid won't know that he's learning anything and the teacher won't really be able to tell very much. And so we're on the same page about wanting kids to be successful, wanting them to feel good, wanting them to be able to comprehend the text that we're teaching. But that's going to come from the work that we do. That's not going to come from, we're going to guarantee it by just putting the kids in easy enough stuff. That's the difference.
I love that. And talking about, providing people with more opportunities with the text.
Yes.
That speaks to scaffolding instead of leveling and
Yes.
having high expectations for all students. Setting the bar high, expecting all students can get there, and our teacher moves. And I love what Dr. DJ Bolger speaks about. He was on our podcast and he was saying, Stacy, there is an art to it. There are active ingredients that the teacher does in the classroom to make sure that students are successful. So those active ingredients, that scaffolding, other kinds of support to allow students to tackle demanding texts without watering them down. And I don't want you to give away everything that's in the book because people can go to chapter 9 and other places. But this is your time, Dr. Shanahan. Say what you want to say.
Well, one of the things that I think we've done wrong, I've approached the issue in a number of ways, but the whole issue of putting kids at their level has really been a guided reading or a directed reading idea. Guided reading is a term that's really become particularly popular because of the book that Irene Faunas and Gay Sue Pinnell wrote. The notion was out there long before they wrote about it. So they have a particular version of it. All I mean by guided reading or directed reading is it's some kind of a reading that a group of people are going to do, usually under the supervision of a teacher, a leader, and you're going to all read it together, and there's going to be some support or guidance given to you, some direction given to you that will allow you to succeed with it and get to where you want to be. And so you can think of you could say, well, gee, I do that in our science class. We have a science chapter that we read and we read it together. Yeah, that would be, an opportunity for guided or directed reading, that communal read. When we do that kind of thing, that's where this whole idea of, wow, they shouldn't all be reading the same book. We've got to have different books so that, we'll have everybody at their level. Where does the teaching come in? And the teaching comes in a couple of places. One place is their original idea when they came up with this instructional level idea. Their conception of learning to read was, what it meant was you would accumulate words. The more words you learned, and so they worked on word memorization. Most programs didn't do things like phonics or whatever. They didn't really think kids were learning to decode. They thought that they were just learning lots of words, and you'd go from one story to another, one text to another, trying to accumulate more words. And so you'd see the construction of the basal readers at the time when I was a boy. They would do things like, we never introduce more than 1 or 2 words on a given page. We always repeat that word at least 15 times within the next, some number of pages. And here are the 72 words we're going to teach in this book. And that is, I swear, that's how they did it. And that was the notion of, well, you always make sure the kids don't know a few words so that they're always going to be learning something. That was one big part of it. Well, we've kind of gotten beyond that, I hope. Though our teaching methods are pretty much the same. We're going to introduce new vocabulary before you start reading this text so that, you won't have any trouble with the words. And then we're going to do some things with those words so you memorize them, and see we're moving you along. The second thing that we've done as instruction in that scheme is we've asked the kids comprehension questions. We ask them questions to reveal whether they understood the text. And our approach to that has been that we ask them particular kinds of questions so that they will know how to comprehend. So we're going to ask a main idea question. We're going to ask a vocabulary question. We'll ask a couple of inferential questions. We'll have a drawing conclusions questions. And the way that's played out over the years, and a lot of our listeners have either done this or had this done to them. We're going to maybe look at the state standards and make sure the questions match those. We're going to look at the test that the state is going to give or that our district's going to give, and our questions will match those. And then the kids will get to practice, and we're going to practice that part of the brain, and they'll be able to comprehend better. When you look at the studies of that, they say we can't tell the difference in those questions and how the kids respond, that they don't reveal anything about comprehension except could they answer the questions or not. There's no pattern. There's no, this kid has a main idea problem. That just doesn't exist. It doesn't work. What differentiates comprehension isn't the question types, it's the passages. And so if you have a passage that's harder, that's going to make a difference in comprehension, but the questions don't make any difference. And so if you have the kids practicing different kinds of questions, doesn't build anything. So what I would suggest with this second part, this questioning, instead of asking kids questions aimed at making them do better on the tests, since that doesn't really work, we should be aiming our questions at identifying what kids aren't understanding in a text, so that we can actually do something about it. So, for example, it's nice that, we're going to ask vocabulary questions, but maybe a better thing to do would be to go in and say, here is a word we think the kids might not know, and you need to get the meaning of this word to get the idea. And so I'm going to ask a question about that idea. I want to see if the kids got that idea. If they did, they probably got that word. If they didn't, we have something to teach. Gee, here's a really complicated sentence. I don't know whether the kids will get this right or not, but I'm going to ask them a question that depends on if you read that sentence properly, you'll be able to answer it. But if you didn't read that sentence well, or you skipped it because it looked complicated, or do all the stuff that kids do, when I ask that question, you won't be able to answer it. What am I going to do with that? I'm going to teach you what to do with a sentence like that. I'll show you how to break that down. I'll show you how to make sense of that. I'll show you how to reduce the complication so that when you're reading on your own, you're going to be able to do that. I'm really talking about teaching kids to read, not just having them practice reading. And I think we haven't been doing that. We've been teaching some words, not a terrible thing, not the best thing, but not a terrible thing. Asking them questions, which is good, but asking questions with the idea of practicing for a test rather than asking questions aimed at revealing what's tripping the kids up. And that can be linguistic, that can be content information, that can be difficulty relating ideas across. There are all kinds of things. I detail a lot of those in the book. Anything that can trip you up, you can ask a question that would reveal that. And there's your opportunities for guidance. There's your opportunities for teaching. It's a different mindset. I'm going to figure out what's blocking you from understanding this text, and I'm going to give you the support that will allow you to figure it out successfully. And you're going to feel good because you figured it out. I didn't tell you. And yeah, it was hard. It wasn't kids will tell me all the time, yeah, I'm doing fine in the reading group, but it's baby stuff. I'm in the low group. I'm in well, it just doesn't turn kids on. Wow, this was really hard for me, but I could do it. I did it. By the end of the week, I could answer the teacher's questions. I was able to read some of that text. It was really cool. That's more the mindset that I'm going for.
So the next question talks about whole class instruction and access to text. And so much of what we've spoken about today has been embedded in this question. So again, feel free to riff on anything inside of this question that you'd like to attend to. In Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, you revisit the long-standing debate between small group instruction and whole class teaching. We've spoken about that. You make a compelling case that every student deserves access to rich, complex text. And you've said that here today, and not a simplified version of it. Talk to us about the research behind whole class instruction, what makes it powerful, and how can teachers ensure that every student benefits with working with challenging text?
Yeah, whole class instruction's big argument for is simply that it gives you a greater opportunity to learn. It's more time. If you look at the studies that find small group instruction is better, what you're going to see is they've done it by bringing in more teachers. And essentially what that means is everybody gets a real opportunity to learn. You get a big chunk of time and you get that much closer attention. If we're really serious about doing small group teaching, we should start hiring enough teachers and building enough schools that everybody's going to have a class of 4 to 6 kids, and we're going to do great. Of course, that's pretty expensive. We're probably going to all get paid $29.95 if we do it that way. The point is, large group instruction increases the efficiency. It gives you greater opportunity, but it has problems, which get addressed by the small groups. It's harder to hold attention. Got to think about that a little bit. It's harder to move turns around because you got more kids that you're thinking about. You got to, there's little Bobby back in that corner and he's quiet, so I'm not paying attention to him. It requires, probably a little bit more planning. And so instead of states and school districts saying, we're going to insist that everybody have small group time and that they set aside 45 minutes of their teaching time to teach small groups, and I don't care if they teach the same thing over and over again, but why don't we use that time teaching teachers some of the ways that you can manage a large group so that you can actually teach this stuff whole class? Now, I'm not suggesting that you do away with small groups entirely. I'm suggesting we use them more strategically than in this notion of we just do that. We always have small group time. I work with the whole class, say with this text. Most of the kids were doing great, but there are some kids here who really struggled with it. I'm going to send everybody else back to their seat to do the writing thing. I'm going to hold these 6 kids and we're going to stay with this a little longer. That would be a very intelligent thing, but wouldn't necessarily always be the same kids. Kids would come in and out of that depending on how they did that day. That would be an example. There were a bunch of kids who missed the first couple days of this. I'm going to do it was one of those weeks. You know what it's like. On Wednesday, I'm going to pull those kids who missed the first 2 days and try to catch them up. That's a use of small group time. But this idea that, oh no, everybody's going to be in small group, there's just not any evidence that that's a good idea. That doesn't make any sense. Unless, again, we're going to get a lot more teachers. Everyone's going to get the same amount of instruction and as much as we have. It's just that we're going to do it under a more powerful kind of setting. And small group settings are more powerful in that sense. They're just not efficient enough. And so it's, oh yeah, we did all those different lessons in the small group and stuff, but since we reduced their time, it didn't actually end up doing any better than the whole class stuff. So why not do the whole class stuff and focus on kids' needs rather than trying to all this balancing act of multiple, 3-ring circus kind of stuff you don't really need to be doing in your classroom.
So here's a contemplation that you most likely hear frequently. I do as well. Some educators hear about whole group instruction, etc., or making sure that people are accessing grade level content rigorous text and worry about people who are still developing decoding and fluency. And I heard you say that as we're teaching rich text, people may have more opportunities with that text. People, while they're reading, we may ask questions to see if they've understood a very complicated sentence. And I love what Scott says in her research about comprehension falls down at the sentence level, to your point. So how, speaking to the educators in the field, how do we meet the foundational needs while still holding high expectations for engagement with grade level text?
Yeah, one of the things I'm pleased with in my book, a lot of books that are arguments, this book is an argument, certainly, they tend to oversell. They tend to overclaim. Oh, this is for everybody. This is for all time. If you do it this way, it'll work. And if you do it any other way, it's not going to work. None of that's true. One of the things that you don't want to work with particularly difficult text is with beginning readers. And the book is quite specific about that. Kids at kindergarten, first grade reading levels should not be taught with really complex text. The purpose, what makes a text complex for kids at those levels is that the words aren't decodable and there's not enough repetition of the words to stick in memory. And so, but the studies also show that by the time kids are beginning second graders, dealing with the grade level text actually and harder actually gives these kids a clear benefit. So I wouldn't be doing this with beginning readers as one example. Well, Tim, I have a fourth grader who's really low in decoding. He's like a beginner. He was never taught it, didn't learn it, whatever. If he's really that low, if he's really below that beginning second grade level or that high end of year first grade level, that might be a kid who gets a different diet of reading than the rest of the kids. But again, once they have those foundational, the basic foundational skills, once they have that idea, it appears that it's not a problem and you can do this, and the kids can still be getting phonics instruction and spelling instruction and stuff about word structure and so on. So that's one thing. Another kind of way that this shouldn't be blocking decoding. There are plenty of older kids who have those basic foundational skills, but as they hit third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade books, those foundational skills are there, but they're not translating into the kids being able to handle multisyllable words or words with complex morphological structures or any of that kind of thing. Odd words like whistle. Kids should be getting not just guided reading time or that my book's focused on. They should be getting instruction in spelling, in decoding, in morphology. All of that kind of word work should be going on. And we should be doing things with the grade level text that we're working with those kids in terms of making sure they're learning the words in them, doing some guided decoding with the words in them, doing fluency work with those texts so that the kids, again, giving them a leg up. One of the bodies of research that I found fascinating was when you test kids on their fluency. What the studies have found is, let's say you have a youngster read a text aloud to you, and he 20 mistakes in 100 words, so it's 80%. Clearly frustration level according to everybody's standards. What if you don't do any teaching, we give the kid no feedback, we just give him the same text again right now and have him reread it? What happens? And what happens, according to the studies, is the number of miscues, the number of errors drops by about 50%. So we're going to put him at a different grade level and teach him at a different level all year, or we could have him read it again, and now he's at his instructional level according to Marie Clay and Faunis and Pinnell. Why would I hold kids back just because we didn't reread the text once without instruction? So we're going to do those kinds of activities with these kids to build those skills along with working with the complex text. And then the last thing, let me say on that, is with those little ones that I was saying we're not going to do this, that doesn't mean we cut them off from complex text. You read complex text to kids. Everything doesn't have to be a simple picture book. You can read some more challenging text to kids, just as I did with my first graders and as I did with my children at home. And these days I try to do with my grandchildren. But we don't ask those kids to try to read those books. That's not the issue right now. Decoding is for them. So I hope that makes sense.
That makes complete sense. Thank you so much. That would be very helpful. So It just speaks to equity. And that's what this next question is all about. You've worked in schools and districts across the country. And what does it take for a system to truly move away from the old leveled mindsets towards a more equitable, evidence aligned approach? So, what role do leaders play in keeping that shift focused and sustainable?
Yeah, if this is going to happen, it's going to require a certain amount of professional development. It's going to require people taking a good look at the book resources they have. I know there are a lot of folks that I'm hearing, oh, they're throwing out leveled readers. Now, they shouldn't be throwing out leveled readers. The problem isn't the books. The problem is how we're placing kids in books. And so leveled readers, some of them might not be good books, but that's not because they have levels. Every book has a level. You can put, if you go home and just, read 4 or 5 books, I bet you can tell me which ones you found harder, which ones you found easier. You could put them on a continuum. Oh, these two seem really similar. Okay, we'd group the books up. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that teachers have high quality, valuable content, and that content can be science or social studies, but it can also be literature and the arts and those kinds of things, stuff worth reading, where we want the kids to actually read those texts and carry away the information from them. So you have to make sure that those kinds of books are there and that teachers have books that make sense. Certainly one thing you don't need to do is make sure that every single thing the kids read is super hard. And I give some suggestions, not research. Well, it's research by analogy, not the way we should use research. I'm trying to guess what would be a good mix of text. How should we move kids through from easier to harder? Leadership in a district could certainly help grade level teachers to make a decision of what a good diet would look like for that. So, giving that kind of support, and then making sure, does a teacher know, and this isn't just for reading teachers, this is for anyone who's teaching giving text-centered instruction in any of the content areas, what does a teacher do if the text proves really hard for the kids? And I think what you're going to find is in most cases, the teacher either tries to find an easier book. So we're not going to work with this. You're not going to learn to read this, which is not a good choice. I'll read this to you, or I'll have the best readers in the class read this to you, which is not a good choice. I will tell you what it says so you don't have to read it, which is not a good choice. Or, okay, if that's what you want, I'll throw the kid into that hard book, but I'm not even going to pay any attention to whether he got it or not. Those are lousy choices. If those are the things your teachers are doing, what leaders need to be doing is making sure, what do you do with vocabulary? What do you do with prior knowledge? What do you do with syntax? What do you do with cohesion? What do you do with text structure? What do you do? How should you be dealing with those? And those are the kinds of things you need real good professional development on, to make sure that everybody's up to speed and can do the kinds of things that really give kids a chance to do very well in reading.
So, yes, and to add to that, I stumbled upon this book a couple of years ago, and I love how you said any educator that has content students need to read, there are things that we can do. And so this book, I was mentioning to you before we started to record this podcast, I have a copy of this in our Seattle condo. I also have a copy of this in my home, and I frequently take this book on the road with me. Well, you were saying it would be important for leaders to be able to provide additional professional learning. And I love how we can put books in the hands of educators, do a book study as a professional learning community, and go for it. So this is not part of the script. I know that we're running long. We'll make this into a couple of part series. However, that being said, can we go ahead and just briefly talk about the chapter that you wrote in this book with your incredible and brilliant wife, Dr.
Absolutely.
Shanahan?
Cynthia Shanahan, who's the real leader on all the secondary work. She taught beginning college students who were the non-traditional students the reading that they needed for years and years and years it makes her sound old. She's very young. At the University of Georgia. One of the things that she figured out over the years was that quite often these older students who are struggling to read, it isn't a decoding problem. It's they don't have any idea how to read history, how to read science. They don't know what the different kinds of demands are. Most of our kids are being taught their reading skills in a language arts class. which is fine. That'll build up vocabulary and give the kids some basic writing skills, one hopes, and so on. But at some point, kids have to learn what counts as evidence, how is information organized, and even things, we were talking about the sentences being a key in comprehension. Science text sentences are very different than the sentences that you see, say, in a literature book. And so I touted our kids should be reading literature, and I think they should in their English classes and in their reading classes, but they also need to be reading science and history and other kinds of texts that put very different vocabulary demands, sentence grammar, sentence syntax demands on them, including the graphics and all of that. So this kind of a chapter really gets into more of those disciplinary demands that if kids don't learn to take those on, they tend not to be very successful, even if they can do what you'd consider to be basic reading.
Thank you for that. And the book is called Best Practices in Adolescent Literacy Instruction, and you would want to check that out. Thank you, Dr. Shanahan. That speaks to change. I can read the book, and I'm a science teacher. I can read Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, and be an elementary teacher and think, oh my goodness, that means I need to change practices. So let's talk about it. What challenges do you anticipate that schools will face when they implement ideas from your book?
I think what you tend to see, and I've done a lot of school improvement work over the years, and luckily quite successfully, including here in Chicago, where I was director of reading and was responsible for more than 600 schools. Change can be difficult initially, but I think the key is to stay very basic at the beginning. Don't try to run, try to walk, see. Don't try to overturn your entire reading curriculum Tuesday. Why don't we try some of this out for, a couple of weeks and then get back together and see where we are and try it again. I do think that at times people try to make too many changes. They put too many mandates. Somebody was just, a reporter this morning was talking to me about a law being considered in some state. And the level of detail for what a classroom teacher was supposed to know or do was so high that I could imagine all kinds of teachers accidentally violating the law. I mean, that's too intrusive, not the way to do it. I think if you can start out getting everybody on board with the idea that we're not going to just try to teach everybody at their level, and let's see how that works with a text or two. And then, like I say, then let's start figuring out what went wrong. How could we do that better? What worked for us? How would we multiply that? I think those kinds of step at a time approaches are really the best way to go.
Which leads us into ideas that we may have to sunset in order to change and move forward and have that gradual approach. This is interesting. In your August 2nd, 2025 blog post, What is the Science of Reading?, you confronted an uncomfortable truth that many practices being marketed as part of the science of reading simply aren't grounded in empirical evidence. So leaders, listen up. You told the story of an author who defended her program saying it's just logical that those things work given to science. Even though, as you pointed out, there was no research supporting that claim. You wrote, my hunches, biases, I about spit out my coffee when I read this, deeply held beliefs and inklings aren't science. And I don't know how hers are so sanctified. That line hit hard because it captures the tension that we all feel between what sounds reasonable and what's actually proven. So why do you think our field keeps confusing logic or conviction with evidence? And how can educators and leaders stay grounded in the research when so many confident claims are being sold under the science banner?
Yeah, I hope my book gives a good model. There are times when I do lapse into opinion and so on, but they're labeled as that. I work really hard at telling people what evidence goes behind, the things that I suggest that we should do. And then I'm equally honest about whether I have experience with those things, how I think they might work, and trying to keep that separate. And I think that's something we all should do. Researchers, teachers, everyone, what do you have real evidence on? If somebody says teaching phonics has been, the National Reading Panel found teaching phonics was beneficial to kids, and we did. We did find that, and you look and go, yeah, they found that for kindergartners. They found that for first graders. That's absolutely true. And the kids did better, not just in decoding, but also in comprehension as a result of that. And that's all good. But then you start getting into, and therefore, here's how you need to teach phonics. Well, did we find that? Whatever scheme that you're propounding, were there really studies that showed that? Well, no, but it just makes sense that if you did it that way, it would work. Or I really like this program that teaches. Even if you really like that program, you shouldn't be making it sound like the way they're doing it is the one that actually works, because we actually found lots of different phonics programs worked. It was teaching phonics that made the difference. It wasn't necessarily we presented it this way or that. Now, that's not entirely true. There are some specifics that we know about teaching phonics, but I think the key is to make sure that when you're using evidence, when you're trying to rely on evidence, that you stay honest about it. And when somebody like me comes into your district, you shouldn't ever hesitate to, gee, you made one claim, but now, it seems like you've made 5 more since you made that initial one when you were talking about the National Reading Panel. Which of these have research behind them? Yeah, speakers don't like that, but that's really too bad. You really should ask us those kinds of questions. You said we should do this 30 minutes a day. Does the research really say that that's what's best? Well, let me tell you how I got that. And that allows you to really make some decisions. And that also allows, when you make those decisions and they don't work the way you thought they were going to, since they had research, you thought it would help, and you've done it now for 2 years and your scores are the same as they were. Why is that? Well, the stuff we really relied on were the parts you told us that you made up. Well, maybe we should change some of those. Maybe those weren't the best choices. Maybe you're doing too much of this or too little of this, or some of the other ways of sharing this information might have been more effective. I don't think we're straight with ourselves all the time. And so holding each other accountable, making sure that when somebody's overclaiming, that we call them out on it, including our best friends and so on, and ourselves when we catch ourselves. I hope the stuff that I write and put on my blog and so on is a good model of what I'm talking about, because I think I do it more than any of the people I read. And I think that's important. I think that's also how you should be gaining trust from people, is by telling them when you're wrong, telling them which ideas you're sharing. There are good data showing that it works that way. The ones you're not, here's why I think that, or here are your choices there, and here's why I would make this one, but other people would make this other one. I just don't think we go out of our way to hold ourselves accountable. And I think it's something we all ought to be calling ourselves out on.
And I wonder if we continue to keep teachers and the success of teachers, because again, the big people shape the little people, and the success of teachers shapes the success of students, and the students are the future generations for the country and the world. I wonder if we continue to keep that as our North Star, that we would be able to say, this didn't work. My thinking has changed on this. And then just to say that, because really the lives that we're talking about are not ours. You're doing fine. I'm doing fine. We most likely have health insurance. We're doing okay. But will the students be able to have literacy proficiency to be able to secure health insurance and a job and a home and a life that they want to live? Yeah. So it really goes beyond us.
Yeah, I don't think that a lot of people understand what educational research tells us. And it doesn't give you, this isn't like medical research. This isn't like medical research where I can say, we did a study with 50,000 people, or we did 5 studies with an accumulated of, 600,000 people. And we found that 87% of the time people with this condition did better. And 9% of the time there was this side effect, and this group didn't do any better. That's really terrific. And that means that a doctor can pretty much trust those data. Man, if I treat 100 patients with this, it'll probably help 87% of them, but it's not going to help all of them. And so I've got to watch those 13. In education, what our data mean is that somebody has managed to show that if you do it their way, whatever their way is, can give kids a learning advantage, can give it. They made it work. That should mean it's possible for you to make it work, but there's not the same kind of guarantee because conditions are so different and our studies are so small compared to those other studies and so on and so forth. And so, something isn't guaranteed to work. If people tell you, well, phonics is really going to help you, it might, but that depends. What are you doing with phonics now? Well, I thought we were doing okay, but it sounds like we need to buy a new program. Well, quite often the new program isn't that much better than the old program, and so you don't see any improvement. You're spinning your wheels. You're replacing one good thing with another good thing, which you can do. Nothing wrong with that, but in some sense, it's a waste of time or money. You'd be better off. What is something that we could change that we think could do better, that somebody has shown that you could do that better if you did it well? And so in other places, it might be, wow, we tried to upgrade our phonics, but since we were doing so well with decoding, it made no difference. Maybe we should be focusing on how hard the books are that we're going to teach comprehension with. That's something we could do, and maybe we could make that work like the studies in Tim's book. I mean, yeah. So I do think we overclaim for research at time. It's always conditional. It's always somebody else made this work. Of course, it gets exciting when you can say 38 different teams of people made this work in their district or their school. The more of that you can see, the more likely it is that I could make it work, but it doesn't guarantee it.
It's a good word. Our daughter is getting her PhD in biomedical engineering, and so she would agree with you with that discussion around the scientific process when you're dealing with heart cells and the replication.
I have a daughter who is a biomedical engineer.
We need to talk. That's so cool. For educators and leaders, here's our last question to round this out for educators and leaders listening today and want to take the next step. What is one thing, according to Dr. Timothy Shanahan, that they can do tomorrow to start moving away from leveled reading towards a kind of evidence-based instruction that you outline in your book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives?
Read my book.
Yes, 1,000%.
That would be first. Yeah, doing something like a book study. Let's take a look at this with a group of teachers and see what everybody thinks and what you could do. I would also, when people read something like this or see something like this, they want to run off and change everything. And I'd suggest maybe the first thing you do is you start to figure out what's really going on in your environment. What are teachers doing? How are they handling reading groups? What levels are kids being taught at? How many of those kids are so low, kindergarten, first grade, that we really are more worried about decodability than complexity? Get the lay of the land, figure out what your situation is, and then take it on, because I think you're going to make a lot better proposals and you'll know a lot better what to do. So the book can help you maybe put that kind of an observation and surveying plan in place. But I definitely think that taking a look at what are you doing now? Gee, our teachers are already working with hard books. They're just not giving the kind of guidance that would let the kids leave. Well, do something different than I would in a district that, wow, we've got everybody in easy books. The first move is going to have to be, let's try it with grade level books. And so we can rate our book room and just give the books to different teachers. So, I always think it's best to take a look and see where you are now, and then take it on, try to improve it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Shanahan, thank you so much for this time today. I feel absolutely honored. Your clarity, your courage, your unwavering commitment to research-driven instruction cannot be overstated. Your mark on the field of education, both nationally and globally, it's incredible. You reminded us that when we anchor a teacher in evidence and give every student access to rich, complex text, we don't just raise scores, we raise expectations and literacy outcomes. And so if you are an on-the-road listener, may this episode push you to question, to read, and to keep returning to the research, because literacy success is not built on trends, as Dr. Shanahan spoke about, but on truth. So if you have found value in today's episode, please support this free podcast. I do not have any subscriptions or paywalls, so you can help us continue to support educators by leaving a good human review wherever you listen to this, and share this episode with educator leaders and friends. And together, we all will continue to do this good human work and moving the world forward. So, Dr. Shanahan, I will put a link to this book in the notes. I will also put a link, if you don't mind, I'd love to put a link to this book in the show notes. I'll give you the last word. Where will people be able to track you down next?
Well, you can always find me at Shanahan on Literacy, my website and podcast and so on. I am going to be making a presentation, I think next week, I'll be at Rutgers University. I'm going to be speaking online, this kind of thing with Reed Washington, and I'm sure some other things. So I'm out there. One thing I'll give you, if you're going to put the book information, Harvard provides some kind of a discount if you buy through them, and so I will send you that code if people want to save a few bucks. They can do that.
That sounds great. And a couple of weeks ago, when I started talking about your book, people continue to say, "Stacy, it's sold out on Amazon." And so heading straight to Harvard Press, that's going to be
Yeah,
clutch.
it's only been out about a month. I think it's run out. They've run out of books a couple of times now. I'm hoping that we'll catch up, but the delays aren't very long. They tell me I have nothing to do with that, of course, but just be patient, and they will get you the books. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Shanahan. And to all the listeners, we will see you down the road a bit, as Dr. Shanahan says on his podcast.